Hey guys, tonight we are diving straight into the life and death battle, where women's bodies become weapons. The showdown between Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. One woman was shattered by 6 pregnancies, yet not a single child survived. Anne, on the other hand, measured every glance, every step, every smile to capture the heart of a king who was ready to discard any wife whose reproductive value had waned. This is not a love story. It is a brutal power struggle in which a single mistake can cost a life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Where are you watching from? And what time is it in your local time zone? Let me know now. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now, ease your body, take a deep breath, and let your eyes flutter closed to the sound of a gentle whisper. Before us stand 2 of the most powerful faces in 16th century Europe, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, both born into the highest noble houses. Each carried ambition and a fierce desire to prove herself, but the paths they walked could not have been more hypnotically different. Catherine of Aragon, christened Catalina at birth, arrived in the city of Toledo, Spain, in the late years of the 15th century. She was the youngest of 5 children born to King Ferdinand, the second of Aragon and Queen Isabella. The first of Castile, the royal couple whose marriage rocked Europe by reunifying Spain and securing lasting peace on the Iberian Peninsula. In her childhood, the little princess lived amongst silken tapestries and the rich tones of cathedral choirs, educated according to strict royal standards, languages, mathematics, history, and, above all, the tenets of the Catholic faith. She absorbed the spirit of a sacred dynasty, understood her duties to the realm, and revealed her leadership gifts at a tender age. Catherine's siblings, Prince John, Princess Isabel, and Little John, nicknamed Juanito, were expected to achieve great things, yet only Catalina devoted herself wholeheartedly to diplomacy and statecraft. Meanwhile, Anne Boleyn, originally Anne Boleyn or Boleyn, emerged from a noble English family that, while prestigious, had less of a direct ruling tradition. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was an ambitious courtier who served as ambassador to France and the Netherlands. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, was the daughter of the Duke of Norfolk, one of the most powerful figures at the English court. Anne was born at Hever Castle in Kent in the early 16th century and was the eldest of 3 children, Mary Boleyn, who would become King Henry VIII's mistress before Anne and George Boleyn, later Viscount Rochford. Anne's formative years were spent in France under the patronage of Mary of Guise, where she absorbed French culture, language, music, and poetry. This education sharpened Anne's wit, honed her adaptability, and armed her with the social finesse that would serve as powerful weapons upon her return to England, where Catherine grew up in the affectionate sanctuary of her parents. Bathed in proud Spanish royal blood and tradition, Anne honed her instincts in the whirl of local politics, where every smile might conceal a plot and every glance a hidden agenda. Catherine, the daughter of the monarchs who launched the final crusade and expelled the Jewish population from their realm, carried the weight of a solemn ruling legacy. Anne, the Duke's granddaughter, learned to manipulate alliances to advance rapidly through the ranks. In terms of education, neither princess lagged behind. Catherine mastered Latin, French, and the Andalusian dialect. She knew the scriptures by heart, understood Roman canon law, and would later serve as regent for Henry VIII during his French campaigns. Anne, by contrast, was the star pupil of the French court school, fluent in French, learned in poetry, gifted in oratory, and passionate about literature. Catherine embodied stability and tradition. Anne became the very symbol of transformation and dazzling energy. Though both stood high in noble rank, their destinies diverged. Catherine was tasked with maintaining peace between England and Spain. While Anne travelled across Europe to gather political experience, Catherine, in her youth, believed she would live a quiet life beside Prince Arthur, only to be swept onto Henry VIII's unsteady throne. Anne, once an obscure court maid, wielded her beauty and intellect to capture the attention of Europe's most powerful king. These differences in birth, education, and culture forged two distinct personalities, each reaching the pinnacle of power, yet carrying hidden yearnings that could never be reconciled. And so fate conspired to set them against one another, not merely for the favour of a hungering king, but for their very survival and for the right to reign. Tonight, we will witness these two warriors, a guardian of old world order and an architect of upheaval, enter the blood-stained arena of power. But the battle has only just begun. Keep your eyes half closed, drifting in and out like drowsy waves, as we uncover the psychological blows and tearful tragedies that bind Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. Relax a little more, for the next chapter will make your heart beat ever more swiftly. On the very first night she set foot in England, Catherine endured a horrifying shock. A group of court physicians stripped away every thread of fabric from her body, measuring every inch of her 16-year-old frame as though she were livestock to be appraised. The silent chamber echoed only with soft breaths and the rustle of silk. Her heart pounded when the gaunt face of Prince Arthur, her future husband, appeared. He was thin and wan, each raspy cough seeming to exhale death into the air. Their wedding night held no romantic glow of candlelight, only a drawn-out nightmare. Petite and fragile, Catherine lay beside Arthur, each passing second revealing his fragility. A single kiss left him breathless. A gentle touch would bring up droplets of blood staining his robe. For 6 months beside Arthur, Catherine lived in a haze of fear. Every night she would awaken to the sound of laboured breathing beside her, her wide eyes filled with dread for her own fate. She wondered if she could ever give hope of an heir to someone whose life was as fragile as a flickering candle in the wind. Those days passed in gloom. Catherine clung to duty and to the slender hope that royal love might soothe her terror. But in truth it was only an endless, exhausting ordeal. Then Arthur departed as lightly as an autumn breeze drifting through an open window. Just when she thought no pain could run deeper, a far harsher trial began. The English court erupted into debate over the validity of her marriage. Whispers rippled through the great halls if Arthur had consummated the union. Then, marrying his brother Henry would violate biblical law and become incest. But if he had not, Catherine remained a precious virgin and still eligible to remarry. She was swept up in a relentless legal maelstrom, compelled to constantly affirm, "Arthur never knew me as a wife, knows her husband." Throughout those interminable 7 years, Catherine stood on the fringes of power, no longer a true queen. She became a woman, suspended halfway to the throne, learning to conform to English customs, with their countless rituals at odds with her Spanish upbringing. Each appearance before the court found her draped in finely embroidered robes, yet her heart grew heavier under the scrutinizing gazes of the nobles. Rumours about her body language and the timing of her monthly cycles stalked her like predators. Though Catherine was fluent in 6 languages, from classical Latin to elegant French and the proud Andalusian tongue, and had been meticulously trained in statecraft by her mother, Queen Isabella, she felt keenly the harshness of court etiquette. Day after day, Catherine wrestled with political ambition and private sorrow. She recalled diplomatic lessons beneath the magnificent vaulted ceilings of Toledo, recalled Queen Isabella's solemn voice, teaching her negotiation and governance. Now, those skills were turned into soft weapons but could not shield her from scandal and gossip. She had to preserve royal dignity while combating accusations of marital discord. On many nights, Catherine sat alone in the silent chamber, the candlelight flickering like her weary heartbeat. She would steady herself, gently stroking an unread page of her Latin prayer book, clutching each word for comfort. Yet sleep would only come momentarily. interrupted by the dread of whether she would be called to swear again tomorrow, and whether anyone would still believe her. 7 years. 7 declarations. 7 endless cycles. Catherine not only endured the agony of loss, but also confronted courtly prejudice and an unending legal spectacle. The only gift she received was perseverance, the steel-fortified spirit imparted by her mother's lessons. Though her body grew exhausted and her mind clouded, Catherine remained resolute in her oath, even as others sought to strip her of every title. And in the stillness of the night, her heart continued its steady rhythm. Her breath came softly, like a lullaby. Yet beneath it lay a deep longing that one day justice would prevail, and her name would be remembered not for whispered slanders, but as a testament to unyielding strength amidst the storm of court intrigue. In the year 1510, at the age of 23, Catherine finally became the wife of Henry VIII. One might have expected her relief and joy to be boundless at last, proving her body capable of bearing life. Instead, sorrow came almost immediately. In the deep chill of January, she delivered a daughter stillborn, tiny and perfect, yet forever silent. Catherine cradled that cold little corpse in her arms for what felt like an eternity, whispering Spanish lullabies in a trembling voice as tears fell onto the baby's unmoving cheek. The court physicians pried the tiny body from her grasp, but the memory of that frozen weight would haunt her for the rest of her days. Only a few months later, Catherine conceived again, and this time she carried to term. In 1511, she gave birth to a son, Prince Henry, who arrived pink-cheeked and vigorous. His laugh, a promise of continuance for the Tudor line. The bells of London pealed. Cannon fire rolled across the city walls. And for 52 brief days, Catherine felt the soaring pride of a mother. She nursed him, sang to him, and allowed herself to believe that at last her suffering had borne fruit. But on the 53rd morning, she discovered his lifeless form in the cradle. No fever, no warning. His tiny chest simply ceased its rise and fall. Catherine's scream echoed from her chamber to the very battlements of the palace, shattering the festive air like a thunderclap. Milk soaked her gown, a bitter symbol of her hope betrayed once more. Grief swallowed the months that followed. By 1512, Catherine was again with child, but the unborn prince or princess did not survive beyond a few fleeting days. The court murmured in sympathy, but sympathy never filled the hollow ache in Catherine's heart. In 1513, another pregnancy ended in sorrow, a baby born dead and cold in the dim light of dawn. And the following year, she bore yet another child who slipped away within hours of its arrival. Each loss carved away at her strength. Her body became emaciated. Her hair thinned until it barely covered her scalp, and her features took on a gaunt, haunted aspect, as though the very light had drained from her soul. She would sometimes catch her reflection in a polished mirror, only to turn away, fearing that she had become nothing but a spectre of the queen she once was. It was in 1516 that Catherine gave birth to Mary, the first child to survive her infancy. At last, a glimmer of triumph, a living daughter held to her breast, her warm weight, a fragile comfort. Yet the joy was tempered by the ever-present dread that Mary might meet the same cruel fate as her elder siblings. Catherine watched her day and night, refusing sleep for fear of missing the slightest sign of distress. Her courtly duties continued, but behind the regal facade lay a woman barely clinging to hope. She wore sumptuous gowns to protect herself from the autumn chill. Yet underneath, her limbs trembled with the memory of so many losses. Meanwhile, Henry VIII's attention drifted elsewhere. In hushed corridors and candlelit antechambers, he observed the young ladies of his court with an appraising eye. Ever evaluating their potential for childbearing, he invited several of them to dine at his table, admired their slender waists, noted the fullness of their hips, subtle signals of fertility that he prized above loyalty or virtue. Rumours spread through the palace like wildfire, The Queen's monthly courses were being medically recorded, discussed openly among the physicians and courtiers, as though they were mere data points. Every month that passed without news of another pregnancy was marked as a public failure. Whispers clung to Catherine's skirts. She is waning. She nears the change of life. She bears no more fruit. Catherine adapted as best she could. She chose looser gowns that skimmed her form without revealing the slightest curve, hoping to conceal both age and grief. Heavy cosmetics masked the grey in her hair and the darkness beneath her eyes. But no powder could hide the sorrow etched into her face. She moved through her days like a ghost, offering polite smiles that never reached her distant gaze. Each appearance before the court felt like an unbearable audition, where every gesture and whispered word carried weighty implications for her position, her reputation, and her very life. In the privacy of her chambers, Catherine endured further indignities. Physicians arrived periodically, not to offer comfort, but to scrutinize her body as though it were a malfunctioning instrument. Cold hands probed her abdomen, measured her hips again and again, and examined her most intimate aspects under the guise of medical necessity. She lay on the examination table, eyes fixed on the painted ceiling above, willing herself not to cry out. Every click of the physician's instruments, every murmur of irregular flow, thin endometrium, signs of early cessation, was another blow to her dignity. She was a queen, yet here she was, reduced to an object of clinical inquiry. Despite the erosion of her spirit and the injustice of her treatment, Catherine continued to fulfill her duties. She presided over state ceremonies, received foreign ambassadors, and offered counsel on matters of law and finance. She spoke multiple languages with grace and authority, drawing on the education her mother, Queen Isabella, had bestowed upon her. But beneath her composed exterior lay a heart heavy with betrayal and exhaustion, and so Catherine's days unfolded in a haze of sorrow and medical scrutiny, punctuated by the fleeting warmth of her daughter's presence. Each morning she rose with the same question. Would this be the day her body failed her once more? Each night she fell into restless slumber, haunted by the spectres of pregnancies lost, and the knowledge that the man she had vowed to serve was already searching for fresh flesh to bear the children he so desperately desired. In the quiet moments before dawn, she would whisper a prayer for strength, for justice, and for the courage to endure one more day in this relentless ordeal. While Catherine's light dimmed beneath the weight of grief and scrutiny, Anne Boleyn quietly sharpened her gaze across the Channel. Having spent her formative years learning the nuances of court life in France, she understood that a queen's beauty, like a rose, could wither overnight. She had watched foreign consorts discarded, seen their value reduced to the fleeting promise of childbirth. From them, she learned a simple rule. The woman who survives is not always the kindest, but the most cunning. In the early 1520s, barely in her mid-20s, Anne returned to England carrying more than just the refined manners of the French court. She brought with her what she would later call her Gallic survival skills. Unlike the pale-haired, full-figured ideal of English beauty, Anne's dark locks, slender frame, and the small, perfectly placed beauty mark on her neck set her apart. Yet it was precisely these differences that gave her power. She knew how to draw Henry's eye without brazenly flaunting herself, turning every subtle glance and whispered compliment into currency. Anne did not storm the Queen's chambers with accusations or lies. Instead, she approached Catherine as a confidant. When Catherine confided in her about Henry's coldness or wept over the loss of another child, Anne listened with the tender patience of a doting friend. She asked the Queen about her health in gentle tones, carefully prying for details about the timing of her cycles, the spells of fatigue, the moments when hope flickered through the gloom. Slowly, Anne wove herself into the inner circle of the court, befriending the other ladies in waiting and transforming Catherine's household into a network of informants. Every tear, every sigh, Every word of desperation was reported back to Anne with surgical precision. Meanwhile, Anne offered Henry the very distraction Catherine could no longer provide. She organised elegant suppers in hidden galleries lit by candlelight, where music and laughter drowned out the heavy hush of state papers. She joined the king on hunts across dewy meadows. Her laughter, light as the morning breeze. Her counsels spirited, yet unobtrusive. During rides through verdant glades, she would catch Henry's eye and offer a knowing smile, as though sharing a secret joke that only they understood. In these moments, the burdens of the crown seemed to lighten, and Henry's rare smiles returned, delayed but genuine. By 1528, Anne's strategy reached its zenith. She orchestrated a banquet of unprecedented splendour, inviting the entire court to Westminster's Grand Hall. Under the watchful eyes of noblemen and ambassadors, she ensured that Catherine was seated in full view of the king and his guest of honour, Anne herself. As the candles blazed and the minstrels struck up a lilting tune, Henry rose with a flourish and, in the presence of all, bestowed upon Anne a set of jewels that had once belonged to the queen, pearls from the wedding trousseau, sapphires from a first anniversary, a golden circlet from Isabella's dowry. Each piece was handed to Anne with a ceremonial grace that left no doubt of Henry's favour. Catherine, overcome by shock and humiliation, faltered. She staggered to her feet, her voice cracking as she cried out for mercy. In that moment of total unravelling, she tore at her hair and struck her own forehead, her grief spilling out in wild sobs. Yet even in her despair, Catherine remained under observation. Anne's loyal spies recorded every shudder, every wail, every broken plea, dispatching their reports back to Anne's private chambers. In this way, Anne not only seized her rival's crown of dignity, but also catalogued the precise methods by which a queen could be undone. In the hush that followed the banquet's climax, Anne received the fruits of her labour. Henry's garze, once distant, now burned with renewed passion. Allies in the council, previously loyal to Catherine, shifted their support. Whispers in the corridors spoke of Anne's poise and intelligence, of her ability to bring levity to the stern halls of power. She had proven herself not just a mistress of courtly charm, but an architect of psychological warfare. Yet, in her mind, Anne recorded more than just the outcome. She noted the timing of each exchange, when Henry hesitated before handing over a sapphire, how the courtiers leaned forward in anticipation, how Catherine's composure crumbled at exactly the fourth offering of pearls. She catalogued the emotional impact on the queen, the way her eyes darted unpredictably, the precise pitch of her voice when she screamed, even the tremble in her once regal hand. These were lessons in power that no French tutor could have taught, nor any Latin treatise prescribed. As the last guests filtered out of the hall, Anne lingered by the side of the king. She spoke of matters of state of alliances with foreign princes, of the need for reform in the church, of the prosperity that awaited England under a new queen. Her words were measured, earnest, and infused with the subtle promise of shared ambition. Henry, emboldened by Anne's victories, took her hand and whispered his devotion, sealing her place not only in his favour but also in the annals of royal intrigue. And so, while Catherine's legacy faded beneath layers of scorn and whispered gossip, Anne emerged as both victor and chronicler. She had mastered the art of courtship and the science of betrayal, ensuring that her own ascent to power would be built upon a blueprint she had drawn herself. Yet, in the quiet that followed her triumph, one question lingered like a shadow. Would she, too, one day fall victim to the very tactics she had perfected? For in Henry's England, the destiny of queens was a fragile tapestry, and no one, no matter how shrewd, remained untouchable forever. In 1529, the year felt heavy with portent as Henry VIII set in motion what would be remembered as the Great Matter, his audacious attempt to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. It was not purely a matter of passion or personal unhappiness. It was a calculated power play designed to wrest control of church authority away from Rome and into his own hands. Henry, consumed by the desire for a male heir and egged on by his new favourite, Anne of Boleyn, sought a formal declaration from the papacy that his union with Catherine had never been valid on the grounds that she had first been wed to his brother. Arthur, if the marriage to Arthur, however brief, had been consummated, then Catherine's subsequent marriage to Henry would be incestuous, forbidden by the Bible. If it had not, then Catherine remained a virgin in the eyes of the law, and her alliance to England could be dissolved. Either way, Henry aimed to clear the path for Anne Boleyn's ascendancy and secure his dynastic ambitions. When Catherine learned of this manoeuvre, she responded with unyielding resolve. The woman who had once governed England as regent during her husband's campaigns, and who had negotiated in Latin and Spanish with foreign ambassadors, was not about to meekly step aside. She declared her intent to contest the annulment by every means available, legal, theological, and diplomatic. She insisted that her marriage was lawful, blessed by God and Pope alike. She proclaimed her unwavering fidelity to her vows, even as the machinery of Henry's court churned against her. The proceedings were convened at the Blackfriars Court in London, and what ensued was a spectacle of public shaming that would haunt the realm for centuries. Catherine, garbed in sombre royal black, was seated before a panel of clerics and lawyers whose sole task seemed to be prying every possible detail from her memory. The questions were fiendish in their cruelty. They asked whether Catherine had removed her nightgown on her wedding night. They asked whether she had seen blood or felt pain. They demanded to know how many times Arthur had visited her bed, as though her most intimate experiences were mere evidence in a lewd trial. The interrogators leaned forward, their quills poised to record each syllable, each falter. The air was thick with the rustle of robes and the muted gasp of onlookers. One of the most harrowing moments came when Catherine was ordered to remove her headdress and let down her hair. In Tudor England, such an act was deeply intimate. Hair was a treasured possession, often veiled in the presence of men. With deliberate slowness, she released the folds of linen and silk, letting her dark tresses tumble down her back. The judges circled her like artisans inspecting raw material, examining the silvery strands sprouting at her temples for signs of age and diminished fertility. Their voices, cold and clinical, speculated about the wear and tear of her body and whispered that her womb might be spent like a broken vessel. Each word fell like a hammer blow to her dignity. Yet Catherine met each question with serene defiance. Her voice, though measured, carried the weight of a queen accustomed to authority. When asked whether Arthur had bared her body, she replied simply, "No, my lord." When pressed about any evidence of consummation, she affirmed, "I have never known him as a husband, knows a wife." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. In that moment, Catherine's unwavering candour reversed the roles. She became the moral arbiter, and Henry's allies, the heartless inquisitors. Over the ensuing months, the trial dragged on, drawing in a motley cast of witnesses. Elderly women who had attended Catherine's wedding were summoned to recall details of a night 3 decades past. Physicians who had never laid eyes on the Queen pretended to infer her virginity from the shape of her gait or the tone of her voice. Theologians argued voluminously about whether a marriage is valid if consummation is incomplete or merely attempted. Each session seemed less about truth and more about spectacle, designed to break Catherine's spirit and sway public opinion. Despite the relentless assault, Catherine's resolve held firm. She rebuked the court for its cruelty and reminded them that she had devoted her life to the service of England. She pointed out that Henry had been a loving husband, that she had borne him daughters, and that his affection for Anne did not negate the legitimacy of their bond. She argued that to annul her marriage was to undermine the sanctity of all holy covenants and to set a perilous precedent for future rulers. But the judges, bound by Henry's will and the subtle threats from Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, found in favour of annulment. On appeal to Rome, the decision was stalled, and Henry, growing weary of papal procrastination, moved to sever England's ties with the Catholic Church altogether. He proclaimed himself supreme head of the Church of England, effectively stripping the Pope of any jurisdiction over his realm. The great matter thus transformed from a personal grievance into a political watershed, the birth of an independent English church. With Henry at its helm, Catherine, meanwhile, was stripped of her title as Queen and banished to Kimbolton Castle, where she spent her final years in quiet defiance, writing impassioned letters that begged the cardinals and the Christian world to recognize her plight. She died, still a queen in her heart, convinced that her marriage had never been invalid. Henry's victory, however complete in his eyes, carried with it the shadow of moral ambiguity and the echo of a queen's steadfast virtue. Thus, the great matter was both a personal vendetta and a seismic shift in religious authority. It demonstrated how the law, sacred and secular, could be weaponized to serve a monarch's ambition, and how a woman's body, reputation, and dignity could be laid bare under the guise of righteousness. The repercussions would ripple through English history for generations, a testament to Catherine's courage and a cautionary tale of power unchecked. At last, through a combination of quiet manoeuvring and a vigour that Henry found irresistible, Anne Boleyn finally secured her place at his side. It was in the bleak midwinter of January, in 1533, under a veil of secrecy, that the king and his new consort exchanged vows, her rounded stomach already, a subtle announcement of the life stirring within. Catherine of Aragon, by contrast, learned of her rival's elevation only through court gossip, and the veiled references slipped into whispers and letters from the very household servants who once served her. There was no formal summons, no royal messenger with solemn words, only the dull burn of betrayal as she read her own erasure in the lines of a seemingly innocuous note. 5 moon later, in the bright light of June, Anne claimed the crown with deliberate display. At her coronation, she dared to cradle her pregnancy before the assembled lords and ladies, a palpable rebuke to the former queen whose womb had yielded only sorrow. Anne chose for the occasion a gown of cloth of gold and purple velvet, the same sumptuous fabrics woven into Catherine's bridal robe nearly a quarter-century earlier. More audacious still, she had her seamstresses stitch into the hems delicate threads and beads salvaged from Catherine's discarded ceremonial garments, a silent declaration that the old dynasty's legacy was now being repurposed into a new order. But Anne's crowning triumph was swiftly followed by ruthless decrees. She declared that any subject who dared utter the name Queen Catherine was guilty of high treason. Courtiers and commoners alike were forbidden to refer to the deposed queen. Her portraits were torn from palace walls, and her personal effects were consigned to flames the moment she drew her final breath. Even the memory of her generosity and steadfast faith was systematically expunged. Anne did not stop at Catherine. She turned her attention to Mary Tudor, the daughter of Catherine and Henry. Then, barely in her teens, the proud princess was stripped of her title, her chambers reassigned, her attendants replaced with spies loyal to Anne's household. Mary was confined to damp, dark rooms deep within the palace, where mould crept along stone walls, and cold draughts stole the warmth from her bones. Her rations were meagre bread and water, until she recited the compelled declaration of Anne's legitimacy and Elizabeth's succession rights. Mary endured this torment in silence, clinging to her mother's memory behind trembling lips, until the new queen's coronation was complete and Catherine's life had quietly ebbed away in exile. Beneath the glittering surface of courtly pageantry, Anne wielded spiritual authority like a scalpel. She oversaw Mary's condition with meticulous scrutiny, demanding regular medical examinations under the guise of maternal concern. Physicians were instructed to record every wasted ounce of flesh, every faltering step, and to relay their findings to Anne's confidantes. The princess's discomfort was amplified. Her suffering turned into a psychological weapon aimed at breaking her will. The palace that once echoed with Mary's laughter became a gilded prison of whispered threats and surveillance, where every knock at the door might bring demands for submission rather than solace. Anne's victory, so dazzling at first, revealed itself to be a cautionary masterstroke of court politics. She had not merely supplanted one queen, she had established the rules for the swift and total obliteration of any royal woman who stood in her way. By crafting laws that equated loyalty to the king with obedience to the new queen, by dissolving the old queen's memory and rewriting the succession, Anne set a precedent that no future consort could ignore. Even as she sat upon the throne, her own power was precarious, balanced on the fearful devotion she inspired in Henry's heart. This was a game played in whispers and decrees, in the silent archives of the royal wardrobe and the shadowy corridors of power. Anne's triumph proved that to seize the crown, one must not only charm the sovereign, but also master the mechanisms of fear and devotion, of legal decree and religious sanction. She had learned from Catherine's tragedy that love alone was insufficient. Instead, she constructed a new regime built on strategic cruelty, where the triumph of one queen spelled the ruin of another. As the candles guttered low and the hush of night settled over the palace, the echo of Anne's ascent lingered like a distant thunder. She had claimed the ultimate prize, Henry's hand, a crown, and a daughter to secure her legacy. But in doing so, she had also drawn the blueprint for her own undoing. For in the court's murmurings, in the Lord's cautious glances, was the knowledge that the same tactics that elevated her could, in time, to be turned against her. And so, even in the soft glow of victory, the whispered question remained: who would write the next chapter in this ruthless chronicle of queens? When Anne Boleyn at last ascended the throne and bore the king's child, her first act was not one of mercy, but of calculated destruction. Catherine of Aragon's only surviving daughter, Mary, was her first victim. Mary's royal title was stripped away with a single stroke from Princess of Wales. She was demoted to Lady Mary, a hollow courtesy that signified loss of heritage, removal from the line of succession. Courtiers who had once bent the knee to her were replaced by Anne's loyal retainers, Mary's tutors, her ladies-in-waiting. Even the humble servants who had once attended her breakfast and brought her letters, all were dismissed and substituted with spies and informers in livery. Greenwich Palace, Mary's childhood home, became an echoing prison, her chamber damp with mildew, cold draughts slipping through ill-fitted windows, lit only by a single flickering candle that cast sinister shadows against the stone walls. Mary's rations dwindled to meagre scraps, tasteless gruel and stale bread soaked in bitter water. Hunger gnawed at her ribs, and thirst parched her throat until every swallow felt like sand. Worse still, her monthly cycle was turned into a public spectacle. Physicians appointed by Anne measured, recorded, and reported every drop of blood as though writing a census of her suffering. They did not come to heal, they came to monitor her decline. The Lady Mary grows weaker each day. Their memoranda would read, "She seems on the brink of collapse." Word of her frailty was dispatched to Anne's private chambers as proof that the former Queen's line could not and should not endure. But Anne's cruelest edict was to force Mary into service as a handmaiden for Elizabeth, the infant daughter of Anne and Henry. Mary was ordered to address her half-sister as Your Grace and to change the child's swaddling clothes, a task formerly beneath a princess's dignity. In the first days, Mary refused to bow her head or to cradle Elizabeth's tiny body. For this refusal, she was dragged from the small, damp room on Greenwich's lower level and thrown into an even darker, colder cell in the tower's dungeon. There she lay, starved nearly to death, her once rosy cheeks hollowed into gaunt plains of bone and her voice reduced to a faint rasp. From that dank chamber, Mary sometimes heard rumours of her mother's suffering. The whispers that reached her ears carried news of Catherine's own imprisonment and imminent demise. Each rumour sharpened her agony. Not only was her body confined, her voice stifled, and her blood monitored, but her love for her mother was turned into a weapon against her will. Mary scrawled letters to her uncle, Emperor Charles V, beseeching him to intercede, to extract her from this living nightmare. Yet every missive was intercepted, read, and hidden from view. Mary realised that only one concession could buy her reprieve: to publicly acknowledge Anne as Queen and Elizabeth as heir. She would sear her own soul, forfeit her legitimacy, and accept the title of bastard. Only then would she be granted the basic comforts of life: a full meal, the company of a familiar servant, the sunlight on her face. And yet, Mary refused, holding tight to her birthright and the memory of her mother's crown. It was not until the bitter dawn of January 7th, 1536, when Mary learned of Catherine's death, that she crumbled. In the cold hours before dawn, she placed her trembling signature upon the document that erased her own princesshood. As she wrote the words, "I, Mary, recognize Anne Boleyn as my lawful queen," she felt her heart shatter. Each stroke of the quill was a fracturing of her identity, a betrayal of the mother who had taught her to speak 6 languages, to negotiate with foreign envoys, to rule with unwavering faith. Now, she was complicit in rewriting her own story. In those final moments, Mary Tudor, once the pride of England, became a symbol of broken lineage. Anne's triumph, however, bore an unexpected seed in crushing her rival's daughter. She planted the roots of a bitter legacy, for Mary's spirit, though forced into submission, burned with a cold, unquenchable rage. That rage would one day fuel her own reign, when she would rise as Queen Mary I, wielding vengeance against those who dared to challenge her right to rule and to punish the faith her mother had embodied. And so the ruin of Catherine's daughter became more than a private scourge. It became the prophecy of a future queen's wrath. In the hush that followed Mary's capitulation, the corridors of power trembled with the knowledge that the methodical destruction of one queen's offspring could give rise to another queen's relentless fury. The seeds of Anne's cruelty, sown in Greenwich's damp cellars, would bloom into flames of revenge that no crown could contain. Just 4 months after Catherine's death and Mary's reluctant capitulation, Anne Boleyn's own fortune began to wane. Henry VIII, already disillusioned when their child was revealed to be a daughter rather than the longed-for son, had carefully studied the methods by which a queen might be undone. He had witnessed, through the great matter, how accusations and psychological manipulation, backed by a pliant court, could strip a woman of her honour and her crown. Now he resolved to deploy those same tactics against Anne, but with a brutality more refined, more consuming. Thomas Cromwell, the king's formidable chief minister, took up his pen and shaped the charges with cold precision. Anne would not only be accused of failing to produce a male heir, but also of an array of grotesque offences: adultery with 5 men, including her brother George Boleyn, conspiracy to poison the king, incest, witchcraft, and high treason. The evidence was scant rumours, whispers, items seized from her apartments, but it was enough. Anne, already in an advanced state of pregnancy, you would stand accused while she carried the fruit of her final bargaining chip, the prospect of a royal son. The trial took place at Westminster in the spring of 1536. Anne was held in the same gloomy cell where Catherine had once languished during her own ordeal, an intentional echo of her predecessor's suffering. It was a cruel irony. Anne, who had engineered Catherine's downfall, now found herself trapped in the machinery of royal justice she had once admired from the inside. Courtiers said it was a demonstration that the king's power was absolute, that no queen was safe once Henry resolved on her ruin. On the day of her trial, Anne appeared before the judges with what dignity remained to her. Her voice was steady as she refuted each charge in turn. "How?" she asked. "Could I commit adultery while so near to giving birth? How could I conspire against a life upon which my own ennoblement depends utterly?" Her arguments were sharp, her logic unassailable, and for a fleeting moment the court fell silent. Yet silence did not equate to clemency. Henry had set his course. Anne's fate lay sealed the moment her crown outlived its usefulness. By the 19th of May, in the year 1536, the verdict was delivered. Anne was stripped of her titles, her properties, her very identity. When the morning dawned, she was escorted to Tower Hill for execution. In a gesture meant to spare her additional indignity, Henry forbade the stake and ordered a sword be imported from France, an executioner skilled in the art of the clean stroke. Even in death, the king demanded perfection. Anne's last moments were attended by a handful of loyal servants. She wore a simple gown, her hair bound beneath a white linen coif. As the executioner knelt, she placed her hands upon the block and raised her eyes to the little scaffold where her young daughter, Elizabeth, watched in silence. In a voice softened by the weight of her predicament, Anne spoke her final words. "My dear child, be strong and virtuous. Pray for the kingdom that it may endure. Know that your mother loved you above all else." And then, in a single, swift motion, the sword descended. The stroke was precise. Anne's head separated from her body with a chilling finality. Her body was hastily laid into an old arrow chest, too narrow for her limbs, and conveyed to the chapel beneath the tower for a hasty burial. No sermon was read over her remains. No prayer offered by the church. As the embers still glowed from the pyre where her jewellery and treasured books had been burned that very morning, the threads of her life were consumed, leaving only ash and rumour. Henry's delight in her downfall was evident too soon. He immediately began numbering the days until he could remarry, already seeking a fresh alliance that would secure his dynasty. But even his triumph felt hollow. The court whispered that no woman could ever trust the king's favour again, that the throne was a perilous seat for any queen consort. Boleyn, once the dazzling jewel of Henry's court, had paid the ultimate price for her ambition. She had overthrown a predecessor with the same brutal tactics that now undone her. In her final confession, she had hoped to save her daughter's future. Yet in her death, she left Elizabeth with a legacy of survival, in the very shadow of the throne's power, an inheritance more complex than any crown. And as dusk fell over the palace that evening, the fields of London were hushed, as though mourning the loss of a woman torn apart by the desires of a king who could not be satisfied, while Anne Boleyn sank ever deeper into the ruthless web she herself had spun. Catherine of Aragon spent her final days clinging stubbornly to a single conviction. She remained the lawful wife of Henry VIII, stripped of every title and authority. She was confined to Kimbolton Castle, a crumbling, damp fortress on the windswept Cambridgeshire heath. Its walls leaked in winter, its hearths sat cold, and its corridors echoed with the footsteps of a solitary household, reduced to a handful of loyal attendants. Every chamber was stark. The word Queen scraped away from furniture and textiles. Yellowing banners, replaced by plain hangings. Even the church at Kimbolton refused her, the rites befitting her station. The chaplain came only to supervise her correspondence and censor her prayers, rather than to offer comfort or absolution. As the weeks drifted by, Catherine's health deteriorated. She suffered from crippling stomach pains that left her doubled up in agony. Her appetite vanished, leaving her gaunt and weary. Swallowing became an ordeal. Each mouthful of gruel brought searing heartburn, while acid reflux burned through her chest. Nights were a faint haze of fever, dreams, and chills. When she was permitted to write to Henry, every line dripped with humility and desperation. "I beseech your majesty to remember the vows you made before God." She penned in one letter, "to recall the nights we shared, the blood I shed for this realm, and the oaths that bound us. But her words fell on ears, deafened by ambition. Henry's courtiers maintained a discourse of celebration as soon as the monarch received word of her passing in early January of 1536. He commanded the entire court to don yellow the hue of triumph, rather than mourning. Catherine's lonely death, as official records noted without so much as a tear shed at court, ignited a slow burn of indignation in her only surviving child, Princess Mary. Mary had already endured the indignity of being declared illegitimate, forced to serve her half-sister Elizabeth, and imprisoned in damp dungeons. But when news of her mother's lonely end reached her, the embers of grief and fury ignited into a blaze of vengeful determination. 2 decades later, upon ascending the throne in the autumn of 1553, Mary I would unleash a campaign of reprisals against Protestants, so fierce that contemporaries dubbed her reign the Burning Time. Hundreds were executed by fire in the name of avenging her mother's memory and restoring the sanctity of the Catholic Church. Mary's reign became a bitter testament to Henry's brutal legacy. The king's cruelty toward his first wife blossomed into an even darker chapter under his daughter's penitent zeal. Meanwhile, Catherine's isolated passing did more than kindle her daughter's vengeance. It awakened a slow, collective realization among the English political class that unchecked royal authority bore a perilous edge. If a queen consort once revered as an intercessor between God and realm could be cast out, humiliated, and allowed to die, forgotten, then perhaps the powers of the crown should be reined in. Over the ensuing decades, echoes of Catherine's fate resonated through parliamentary debates and pamphleteering, chipping away at the divine right doctrine that had long shielded the monarch from accountability. Yet for Catherine herself, there was no relief in the thought of future reforms. Her last breaths were drawn in the silence of a neglected chamber, her prayers unanswered by the king who had exchanged his queen for a mistress. The few attendants who cared for her spoke in hushed tones of her final testament, a whispered claim that she would die in this opinion of the validity of her marriage. Even as her strength ebbed, she refused to relent, an unbroken spine in the face of abandonment. A small crucifix remained clutched in her hand when she finally slipped away, a final act of defiance against the court that had stripped her of every earthly comfort. In the years that followed, Catherine of Aragon's story passed into legend. Poets and chroniclers reimagined her as a regal martyr, persecuted for her fidelity and faith. Meanwhile, Anne Boleyn's own downfall served as a grim coda. The queen who had tormented her predecessor would herself be swept away by the same tides of suspicion and violence. Henry VIII's reign thus stands as a tapestry woven with threads of ambition, betrayal, and unrelenting authority. Yet from the shadows of that tumultuous era emerged a profound lesson for England. Even the most exalted throne could not stand forever without the assent of those it governed. And so, as the candles gutter and the last echoes of Catherine's weeping court fade into memory, we recognize that her life and her lonely death helped to reshape the very fabric of English governance. The brutality inflicted upon her body and spirit awakened not only her daughter's wrath, but also the long, slow movement toward constitutional restraint. In the hush of a winter's evening, one might almost hear her soft sigh carried on the wind across the green fields of Kimbolton, a spectral reminder that power untempered by mercy leaves a kingdom forever haunted by the ghosts of its queens. The tragic death of Catherine of Aragon and the execution of Anne Boleyn left an indelible mark on England, one that rippled through religion, politics, and the very psyche of its ruling women. In the realm of faith, Henry VIII's determination to annul his marriage to Catherine severed England from the authority of the Roman Church. By declaring himself supreme head of the newly formed Church of England, he not only set in motion the English Reformation, but also ignited religious conflict that would smoulder for centuries. Catholic worship was outlawed. Monasteries and convents were dissolved, their treasures seized by the crown and redistributed to the king's loyal subjects. The faithful who refused to abandon the old rites found themselves branded heretics, persecuted, and stripped of property. This schism carved a deep rift across the realm, pitting neighbour against neighbour in bitter sectarian strife, an era of recusancy fines, secret masses in hidden chambers, and martyrdoms that echoed long after the initial break. Societally and politically, the Tudor saga set a grim precedent for the suppression of powerful women. Under Henry's rule, a woman's worth was inexorably tied to her reproductive capacity. Those who bore healthy male heirs were celebrated until they outlived their usefulness. Those who failed, like Catherine, or who wielded influence too boldly, like Anne, found their talents and virtues twisted into evidence of moral or political treachery. This harsh lesson endured into the age of Elizabeth I. Henry's daughter by Anne, Elizabeth, acutely aware of her half-sister Mary's brutal reign of revenge and the fate of her mother, chose a path of strategic solitude. By styling herself the Virgin Queen, she transformed her celibacy into a shield marriage she believed would imperil her throne, leaving her vulnerable to court factions and foreign intrigues. Yet, by refusing to marry, she also sacrificed the prospect of a dynastic heir, placing the future of the Tudor line in perpetual uncertainty. Elizabeth's reign, long and remarkably stable, thus became a testament to the painful calculus imposed on royal women: marry and risk annihilation, or remain alone and risk extinction of your bloodline. On a more intimate level, the intertwined tragedies of Catherine and Anne instilled a culture of paranoia and self-censorship among court women. The once grand tapestry of court life unravelled into a network of informants and whisperers. Every confidant might be a spy, every servant a potential witness in an impending legal drama. Women learned early that discretion and subtlety were their only allies. Openness, sincerity, or visible ambition could be weaponized against them. As a result, princesses and duchesses perfected the art of masking true opinions behind polite smiles and crafted personas designed to appear unthreatening. They spoke in half-phrases, dropped hints instead of declarations, and employed coded compliments to curry favor without revealing strategy. Survival became an exercise in patience and prudence. One false move, one too earnest protest, and a woman risked being cast aside or worse. Like Anne, condemned as a traitor and criminal. Over the decades, these lessons shaped the behavior of successive generations of noble women. Catherine Parr, Henry's final queen, made a point of avoiding public controversy and never bore him a child, perhaps mindful of her predecessor's fates. Mary Tudor's own daughter, Queen Mary II, who reigned jointly with William of Orange in the later 17th century, remained childless and wary of political entanglements that might threaten her legitimacy. Even into the 18th century, aristocratic women were often advised to cultivate superficial accomplishments, music, embroidery, rudimentary literacy rather than deep political knowledge, lest their intellectual prowess attract suspicion of overreach. Thus, the twin tragedies of Catherine and Anne did more than alter the course of English history. They rewrote the unwritten rules for every woman who would step into the royal or noble sphere thereafter. Public virtue became inseparable from private danger. Faith, once a matter of personal conviction, assumed political weight. A queen's womb became both the ultimate symbol of power and her most perilous liability. For every daughter born to succeed, there was a stepmother waiting in the wings, ready to seize that daughter's inheritance, and perhaps her head. And so, as the Tudor court, once glittering with the promise of dynastic stability, receded into memory, it left behind a legacy of cautionary whispers. In candlelit antechambers, ladies-in-waiting would recount in hushed tones the fates of two remarkable women, one who refused to renounce her vows and perished in isolation, the other who seized the crown only to be undone by the very tactics she perfected. Their stories became bedtime warnings, lulling each new generation of royal women into a wary watchfulness. Ach understood, in the soft darkness, that to occupy the highest throne was to stand upon a field strewn with the shattered hopes of those who had come before. and that the next misstep might yet be their own. The saga of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn extends far beyond a mere dynastic struggle. It stands as a brutal testament to the Tudor political and cultural machinery, in which a woman's worth was measured almost exclusively by her ability to bear children. Both women, born to privilege one, a Spanish infanta, raised as heir to the united crowns of Castile and Aragon. The other, the ambitious daughter of an English courtier, found themselves judged by the same unforgiving standard. If they succeeded in producing a male heir, they were exalted. If they failed, their names, reputations, and very existence were subject to erasure. Catherine, the steadfast daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, had arrived in England, laden with royal expectations. She spoke 6 languages and had been trained in statecraft by the finest minds of her time. Yet once her womb failed her repeatedly, 6 pregnancies ended in loss, she became a political liability. Her dignity stripped away one humiliating decree at a time. Anne, by contrast, returned from France armed with a more ruthless education that in the court's theatres of power, beauty and wiles could be as potent as armies. She weaponized her intellect and faith, weaving theological doubts into Henry's psyche until he was convinced he needed her more than Catherine. But when Anne, too, failed to deliver a son, the same mechanisms she had mastered were turned against her in a swift, unceremonious trial and execution. Their parallel downfalls exposed the inherent insecurity at the heart of Henry's male-dominated regime. Both queens were first deposed through legal wrangling charges of consanguinity in one case, conspiracy and adultery in the other, and then physically expunged from court life. Catherine sent to dim exile and clinical neglect, Anne beheaded on a foreign blade. In each instance, Henry VIII moved to obliterate every trace of them, orders to burn their letters, destroy their clothing, even censor mention of their names, because he feared that any surviving memory of their power might encourage other women to challenge his authority. Yet from their tragedies arise unexpected inspirations. Catherine's refusal to relinquish her title, even as her last possessions were seized and her name struck from official records, speaks to an indomitable commitment to principle. She clung to the belief that marital vows, once sanctified before God, could not be undone by royal decree. Anne, for her part, demonstrated a shrewd grasp of psychological and religious leverage long before modern strategists articulated such techniques. She understood that control of the king's mind could outweigh any claim to birthright or wealth. Even in her final hours, facing the executioner's block, she composed herself with dignity, offering prayerful counsel to her daughter, Elizabeth. These dual narratives reveal the hollowness of a patriarchal system that claimed absolute power, yet relied upon silencing women to maintain its facade. Henry's ultimate fear was that a woman's will, whether demonstrated through unyielding fealty or cunning persuasion, might unsettle the throne itself. Thus, the Tudor court became a crucible in which every aspect of a queen's personhood, her body, her voice, that her reputation was subject to political exploitation or outright erasure. For future generations, the lessons of Catherine and Anne resonate deeply. They illustrate the cruelty of a system that treats women as mere vessels, valued only for their biological function. Yet in response, both women transcended that reduction. Catherine asserted her value through unshakable faith and the firm application of diplomatic expertise. Anne carved out her influence through rhetorical skill and an almost clinical understanding of courtly psychology. Their stories remind us that true power lies not merely in occupying a throne, but in asserting one's autonomy over one's body, one's mind, and one's legacy. When we look back on the Tudors, we must recognize that their reigns were not just about succession and royal policy. They were also battlegrounds over who controls history's narrative and whose voices will be heard. Catherine's stubborn insistence on her status forced Henry to break with Rome. Anne's rise and fall exposed the vulnerability of a king who could be manipulated through faith and desire. Their combined impact set the trajectory for religious reform, emboldened future queens to guard their prerogatives, and taught noble women the art of survival through discretion and resilience. Ultimately, the fights of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn teach us that oppression of women's bodies and psyches may be ruthless, but it can also produce extraordinary figures of strength and intellect. As we reflect on their intertwined fates, we are reminded that when a woman falls, it is not only her personal tragedy, it is a wound in the social fabric. Their legacies challenge us to honor the fullness of women's contributions to history, to politics, and to moral courage beyond any narrow definition of utility. And in the quiet moments before sleep, we might imagine those two formidable spirits standing together beyond time's veil, their voices echoing a single, haunting insistence that dignity and agency can outlast even the fiercest storms of power. After the bloody legacies of their mother and aunt, two daughters, Mary Tudor and Elizabeth Tudor, bore the scars of their family's violent politics and carried them into their own reigns. Mary, as the eldest surviving child of Catherine of Aragon, grew up in the shadow of her mother's abandonment and public disgrace. She had been declared illegitimate, stripped of her titles, and forced to witness the merciless removal of Catherine's status. Those memories crystallized into a fierce fury, a thirst for retribution that would shape her every action once she ascended the throne. When Mary assumed the crown in the year 1553, she set about exacting vengeance on the religious faction she held responsible for her mother's fate and her own degradation. She reversed the English Reformation in one sweeping, draconian series of edicts. Hundreds of Protestant clergy and laypeople were condemned as heretics and burned at the stake. Scribes recorded day after day of funeral pyres lit across Smithfield and other grim squares, the air thick with smoke and lamentations. Her regime became synonymous with merciless religious persecution, earning her the infamous sobriquet Bloody Mary. In her mind, each flame that consumed a condemned soul was a measure of justice for her mother's sufferings and a stern warning to any who dared oppose the revival of Catholic orthodoxy. Meanwhile, Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, watched these events unfold with a mixture of horror and resolve. Though she too had been marginalized, denounced as a bastard, her mother executed, she determined never to let her personal life be dictated by marriage, as had been the downfall of her aunt. Upon taking the throne in 1558, Elizabeth I established herself as the Virgin Queen, a living embodiment of unassailable sovereignty. By refusing all offers of marriage, she ensured no husband could wield the power to depose or betray her. Under Elizabeth's calm but shrewd stewardship, England entered its golden age. The arts flourished. Playwrights such as William Shakespeare penned timeless dramas for the Globe Theatre. Poets like Edmund Spenser chronicled the glories of their era. Architects raised stately country houses and ornate public buildings in the new English Renaissance style. Explorers, outfitted by her court, navigated the globe in vessels known as the Golden Hind and her sister ships, planting the seeds of an empire that would span oceans. Yet perhaps Elizabeth's greatest triumph was her establishment of the Via Media, a middle way between Roman Catholicism and radical Protestantism. By passing the Act of Uniformity and encouraging a temperate form of worship, she prevented the sectarian bloodshed that had torn her sister's reign apart. Clerics who publicly disavowed the Queen's religious settlement faced censure, but few met the stake. Instead of torches and tribunals, Elizabeth wielded charters and debates, persuading moderate factions to accept her compromises. Peace, at last, reigned in England's churches and in the wider society. The divergence between Mary's iron-fisted reprisals and Elizabeth's diplomatic realpolitik reflects the deep psychological imprint left by their shared childhood traumas. Mary's wrath sprang from endless nights, hearing whispers of her mother's fate, from the ache of having to repudiate Catherine's memory to save her own life. Elizabeth's measured tact, by contrast, arose from knowing too well how swiftly a queen could fall when her marital alliance soured. Both sisters grew up learning that the personal is political for Mary. That meant crushing her adversaries. For Elizabeth, it meant outmaneuvering them through intellect, rather than force. Together, these two remarkably different reigns underscore how the feud between Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn echoed down the generations. The violent uprooting of one queen, followed by the execution of another, established patterns of religious division and monarchical dominance that would define English history for well over a century. Catholic recusants and Puritans alike remembered Mary's fires. Just as Anglicans and latitudinarians honoured Elizabeth's compromise, their stories also reveal the enduring truth that the battles waged over a monarch's body in this case. The Tudor Queen's body, as symbol and vessel, can shape a nation's soul. Catherine and Anne had been pitted against each other in a struggle for Henry VIII's favour. But in the end, it was their daughters who inherited the consequences. Mary, who unleashed fury in the name of filial loyalty. Elizabeth, who forged stability through restraint. In the soft hush of history's afterglow, we see how a mother's ordeal and an aunt's cunning produced two sisters whose reigns defined the English polity. Mary's legacy of fire and blood forced Elizabeth to choose a different path, one of caution and compromise. The religious and cultural schisms they presided over, each in her own style, echoed the original conflict of the royal chamber. Thus, the cruel contest between Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn did more than seal their own fates. It cast a long shadow over England's spiritual and political landscape, and in that shadow, Mary Tudor and Elizabeth I emerged as twin testaments to the power and the perils of female sovereignty in a world determined to judge women by their wombs. The Tudor feud, marked by ruthless intrigue and a clash of powerful women, has become an endless wellspring for popular culture. Over and over, screenwriters, novelists, and playwrights return to the tragic lives of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, mining their stories for new angles and fresh emotional resonance. In one breathless series, The Tudors, viewers are drawn into an almost operatic retelling of Henry VIII's court, with grand costumes and sumptuous sets recalling the glories and horrors of Renaissance England. In another, the film Anne of the Thousand Days dramatizes the final, desperate months before Anne's fall, heightening every whispered accusation and stolen moment as if the very heart of a kingdom hangs on each word. On the page, Hilary Mantle's Wolf Hall delves into the mind of Thomas Cromwell, offering a starkly different perspective. There, the camera of prose focuses less on princesses and queens than on the shadowy functionary whose ambition and loyalty shaped the fate of both Catherine and Anne. Through his eyes, readers see Henry as both puppet and puppet master, straining against the strings of Protestant reform and dynastic necessity. Each depiction, whether visual or literary, chooses its own narrator and its own moral centre. Some present the women as tragic pawns of patriarchal power. Others paint Henry's downfall as the result of being enthralled by female wiles. This multiplicity of viewpoints has made Tudor a subject of both academic study and mass-market entertainment. Museums across England display the actual gowns, fragile silks studded with pearls, and the jewellery once worn by these women, drawing visitors by the thousands each year. Letters penned in delicate script are exhibited alongside newly discovered fragments of court gossip, giving flesh to the rumours that Catherine's body was laid bare by court physicians, that Anne's first dance with the king marked the beginning of the end, and that the Blackfriars trial was a grotesque spectacle of sexual humiliation. Yet what anchors all these retellings is a recognition of the indelible humanity of Catherine and the cold cunning of Anne. Catherine emerges repeatedly as the noble victim of political expediency, a woman who dared to insist on her rights and died in exile, still declaring, "I am the king's true wife." We pity her, even as we marvel at her steadfastness. Anne, by contrast, appears as both seductress and strategist. Her recorded prayers and poems reveal a woman of genuine faith, while her carefully plotted turns of phrase expose a mind as sharp as any counselor's. Readers and viewers recoil at her manipulations, even as they admire her audacity. Through centuries, England's collective memory returns to their saga. As though the Tudor court itself were a dark mirror, reflecting society's deepest fears about female ambition and bodily autonomy. If you want to understand Tudor women, people say, study these two queens. In them, we see the extremes of what it meant to be a royal woman to rule or be ruled, to march toward the scaffold or cling to a crown that might be snatched away at any heartbeat. This ongoing fascination reveals more about us than about them. We remain captivated by the idea that a single body, Catherine's or Anne's, could become the battleground for religion, politics, and personal survival. We return again and again to those whispered confessions and public humiliations because they dramatize the collision of private sorrow with public spectacle. They remind us that power is never abstract. It is felt in the narrow confines of a cold chamber, in the delicate flutters of a silk sleeve, in the faint echo of a condemnation pronounced from a stone throne. As we close the curtain on this chapter of Tudor history, laying sleepily against our pillows, we carry with us the echoes of their voices. We remember Catherine's dignified refusals, her solemn vows that I will die, the king's true wife, and Anne's fearless challenges, her relentless quest for influence. Their stories, told and retold, continue to shape our understanding of gender, faith, and power. And in that haunted space between history and myth, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn live on, silent witnesses to the costs of ambition, the cruelty of dynastic politics, and the enduring strength of the women who dared to stand at history's centre. Finally, the story of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn is not merely a personal tragedy, but also a mirror reflecting fundamental principles of power, honour, and human worth. From the tear-stained and scheming lives of these two queens, we learn that, firstly, true power does not reside solely in titles or crowns, but in the ability to stand firm in one's convictions and beliefs. Catherine, though discarded, continued to assert that she was the lawful wife of Henry VIII. Her loyalty and determination lent her strength to withstand public opinion. Even if tragedy ultimately prevailed, we learn that sometimes, even amid the fiercest storms, only inner strength can keep us from being swept away. Secondly, strategy and intellect, as used by Anne, can pave a path to the summit, but they cannot hide one's true nature when justice is twisted. Anne Boleyn skillfully exploited psychology, religion, and her network of allies to advance herself. Yet those very tactics became the weapons used to bring about her downfall. The message here is clear. Success built without integrity and respect for others will sooner or later end in failure. Thirdly, history shows that women, even at the highest rank, can be judged and defined solely by their ability to bear children, a deeply inhumane standard. Through this brutal struggle, we understand that any society that fixates on women's bodies and reproductive functions is one that stifles their freedom of choice, their autonomy, and their true value. This serves as a warning to all: do not judge or confine a person's dignity based merely on their physical form or reproductive role. Finally, the Tudor tragedy teaches us compassion and vigilance. When we revisit the stories of Catherine and Anne, let us extend empathy to both. They were victims of their era, of ambition, and of rigid laws. At the same time, we must remain alert to systems of power that manipulate legal, media, and psychological tools to serve personal agendas. Therefore, through this video, we take away that genuine power is not coercion but the ability to uphold one's conscience. Lasting victory does not come from deceit but from integrity. And every individual, regardless of gender, deserves full respect and dignity, in autonomy, and in the pursuit of a fulfilling life. Thank you for journeying with us to the end. If this story has given you anything, share your thoughts. And don't forget to follow our next videos as we uncover more haunting pages of history filled with lessons that transcend time.